Hey everyone, welcome to this video on const, let, and var, 3 ways of making a variable in JavaScript. Please like this video if you like it, subscribe if you care, and leave comments that are nice and respectful and not about my glasses. Okay, let's go. Let's begin with a little bit of history. This line is actually a highly sophisticated timeline diagram going from 1997, when JavaScript was created, to modern day 2018, 2019. Basically, the beginning, there was var, and that was it. That was the only way of making a variable. You use the var keyword, and that was the case all the way up until 2015 when let and const were introduced. But that's kind of a lie, because you couldn't just go use let and const right away. It was really just the idea of let and const that was introduced. It was added to the specification, this little section right here in ES 2015 that says, here's how let and const should work, but that doesn't mean you could just go and use them right away. In fact, it took a little bit, but now in 2018, pretty much all the major browsers, this is for const, you can see all the major browsers support const. Let is a little shakier. If we look, like Opera Mini, an Android browser, doesn't support const doesn't support let just yet, but almost everything does. So what that means for us is that we have a choice when we want to make a variable. Do we use var, let, or const? And in this video, I want to help explain the differences, but also help you decide when to use which one. All right, so let's begin with our good friend var. The most important thing to talk about is how variables are scoped when we declare them with the var keyword. So they're scoped to the current execution context, which basically means they're scoped to their enclosing function, if they're in a function, and if they're not, then they're part of the global scope. So for example, here is a variable, var I is part of this for loop. It's inside of a function. It is scoped not to this loop, but to the entire function. So I can access it in the function, of course. If I try and call it greet, we print out hello 3 times from this loop, but then I still have access to I after the fact. Of course, I don't have access to I anymore because we're outside of that function, that execution context. So the main point is that when you use the var keyword, it is not a block scoped variable, meaning that if we have a conditional statement, it is not scoped to that conditional statement. Those variables, if you use the var keyword, are scoped to an entire function or to the global scope. That changes when we introduce let and const. So let's just subtly shift this to be let. Let I equals 0, I less than 3, I plus plus. We print out hello, and then afterwards, after that block ends, we're going to print I. Run it, and we have a problem. I is not defined right here anymore. It's only a part of this block. So here's another example. If I do if true, a very silly, trivial block, and I declare a const, and we'll talk about the difference between let and const in a moment. Const color equals purple. If I try and access color outside of this, console.log color, I don't have access to it. Color is not defined. It's only part of this block. But if I change that to a var, that's not the case anymore. It is scoped, in this case, to the global scope. It's not part of a function. So that's the first distinction. Let and const are block scoped. Var is not. When you declare a variable with var, it's scoped to the current execution context. Now let's talk about the main difference between let and const. They're both block scoped. Const stands for constant. And the main idea behind it is that it's not supposed to change. Now that doesn't mean it's immutable. It can't change at all. It means that the reference that the variable is pointing to, sort of like the link in memory, that can't change. So as an example, if we make a const over here called pet and set pet to pig, I can't go and say pet is now dog. That's a problem. What I can do, for example, is make a const people, set it equal to an array. I can't just reassign that entirely and set people to be something else, like 12, but I can update the values inside of people, or I could push onto people like this. And I'm still changing people. The difference is that I'm not updating the reference. This is pointing to the exact same array, the same object in memory. So that's true for arrays. I could also do an object literal and change the properties. I just can't change that reference. So that's an important distinction. With let, on the other hand, we've already seen this. We used it in a for loop. You can update it at any point. Essentially, let is the var keyword, but block scoped. Const is different because it also adds this new restriction. It's not supposed to be reassigned. Other than that, there's a couple of quick things to discuss. The The first is that when you declare a var in the global scope, it is added to the window object. For example, if I just do var x equals 1, save, if we look at the window object, somewhere in here, we'll find x. There it is, x1. Now, if I tried that instead with let dog equal rusty, and I save, there is no window.dog. It's a global variable declared in the global scope. It is not added to the window object, and the same applies for const. The next thing I want to talk about is that we can declare a var with a value when we actually declare the variable, or we can declare it and not initialize it. So I can do this, var color, and not give it a value, and then later give it a value. Same thing with let. I can say let pig, but I cannot do this, const chicken. That's a problem, because const is supposed to be constant. It's not supposed to really change, meaning that you need to know ahead of time what the value will be, so you can't initialize or you can't declare it without a value. The other thing that's important with a variable created with var, we can redeclare the entire variable whenever we want. I can say var x equals 10, and then say actually var x is something else entirely. So I'm not just updating the value, I'm not reassigning x, I'm completely redeclaring it. Now, if I tried that with let, if I just change that to be let, we'll get an error saying identifier x has already been declared. Same thing with const. So that's important to note. And for that reason, really only for that reason, sometimes I use var when I'm teaching these days, because when I'm in the console creating variables and reassigning them, sometimes it gets annoying to have this error if I don't refresh the page, if I've already declared a variable. And that's pretty much it. If we take a look, to recap, let and const are block scoped. Var is scoped to the current execution context. Let and const do not create properties on the global window object if they are declared in the global scope. You can initialize let with or without a value. Const, you have to have a value. Let can be reassigned whenever. It's like a var, except it is block scoped, but it cannot be redeclared in the same scope. Const, on the other hand, has this additional restriction. It cannot be reassigned. It doesn't mean it's immutable and it can never change, but the reference that variable is pointing to cannot change. It's block scoped, and we already talked about this other stuff. There is one thing I'm not talking about though. There is some difference between let, const, and var around something called hoisting. If you're not familiar with hoisting, I'm going to make another video on that. I originally had it as part of this one, but it was getting really long. So I split it off, introducing the topic on its own. Let, const, and var do behave a little differently around hoisting, and I left that out. And this is the last thing I'll mention. Basically, I use const whenever I can and try and use it over let. Use let if you have to instead of var, and pretty much never use var. I can't really think of a good reason to use var except for what I said when I'm teaching in the console, because it's annoying to get that error about redeclaring a variable. So sometimes I do use var there, but for the most part, just use const and let all the time. All right.